Test, test. Okay. The committee will come to order. First off, I want to start off by thanking the Resources Committee again for their room, and I want to make an announcement to the members that tentatively, the next time we have a markup, we'll be back in our own room. Yeah, no kidding. So all things going as planned, if they stick to their deadlines, the contractors, we should be, when we return from recess, we should be able to get back into our own room. We are meeting this morning to consider 8 bills within the committee's jurisdiction. We are going to consider each bill individually with a separate opening statement and a walkthrough for each. I'll begin with my opening statement and then recognize Mr. Levin for his opening statements. The House is going to have votes this afternoon. We will recess when those votes are called and resume business immediately after. I also understand that the Ethics Committee is meeting, so if I'm not mistaken, there are 2 members of the Minority and Ethics Committee as well as 2 members of the Majority, so that means we'll have equal absence for our Ethics Committee members when they're gone. We have the budget on the floor, so our budget chair, who's also a member of the full committee, will be on the floor. So all other members, I would recommend sticking around because we've got committee business to do because there are legitimate absences among other members. Normally we would have markups in the morning, but because we had the Afghan president today, we had to start at this stage. So let me get into our opening statements and then we'll proceed.
Good, thank you.
All right. We're marking up a lot of bills today. The point that we are trying to make here is this. The IRS works for the taxpayer, not the other way around. It is their job to make sure that doing your taxes is as easy as possible. And so the burden is on them to prove any wrongdoing. The burden is on them to protect people's privacy. The burden is on them to tell the taxpayers their rights. And that's the attitude that the IRS should have. But that is definitely not the attitude that we have today. If our investigations have shown us anything, it's that bureaucracies don't do what's efficient, they do what's convenient, or at least what is often convenient for them. Well, principles aren't always convenient. And what we have here is a matter of principle. So we're going to insist that the IRS do their job the right way. Now, these reforms are simply common sense. All we're saying are things like don't target people based upon their political beliefs. Don't tax donations to tax-exempt groups. Don't send taxpayer information to your private email. You know, pretty simple stuff. And there's another thing we've learned, and that is this kind of mischief grows in the shade. We found out about this stuff because we dug deep, because we brought much-needed transparency to our system. And the only way to hold big bureaucracies accountable is through rigorous and effective oversight. But the thought I want to close with is this. All of the confusion, all of the unfairness, and all of the frustration, all of this comes from the fact that our tax code is a mess. It is way too complicated. It punishes people for working, for saving, for investing, all the things that we need to build a healthy economy. Sometimes it even pushes people from beyond the grave. That's why today we're here to repeal the death tax. Now, I realize my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have strong opinions that don't necessarily square up with ours, but this is something we feel very strongly about. People work hard and they pay taxes all of their lives. They've earned the right to leave something to their kids, often a family business. And this is a right that they have earned that ought not be penalized for doing so. And this tax doesn't just hit the big guy, it hits the little guy, like the small business or the family farm. It is both unwise and unfair, and we believe it needs to go. In fact, we need to replace our whole tax code. We need to make it simpler, flatter, and fair. That would create more opportunity in our country, and it would build a healthier economy for everybody. So I'm glad we're taking a step in the direction that we're taking today. I'm glad that we're putting hardworking taxpayers and their concerns front and center. I'm glad that we're applying lessons we learned from our oversight and investigations, and I'm glad we're taking this step on behalf of families who wish to grow a business, raise a family, and pass it on to the next generation. And with that, I'd like to yield to Mr. Levin for any opening statement that he might have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to everybody. As mentioned, there are various committee meetings going on, ethics, the budget on the floor, and we appreciate your accommodation, Mr. Chairman. Also, several of us are in a classified briefing. Mr. Rangel has been delayed there. Mr. Thompson and I think, are going to go back. As I understand it, we're taking up the IRS bills first. I don't think there's any controversy about them. And I don't think, unless one of my colleagues wants to have an opening statement, that in addition to mine, there won't be any.
Okay.
And so we'll proceed, as I understand it, after you and I talked with those bills, and come last to the estate tax with enough notice for all of us to be here who can be. So thanks very much, Mr. Chairman, for your accommodations. So I'm going to give an opening statement on the IRS bills, but especially on the estate tax bill. Last week, the Pew Research Center unveiled results from a recent survey of Americans about the tax code and tax reform. Overwhelmingly, the greatest concern among those surveyed, both Democrats and Republicans alike, and 80% of Americans overall, was that some people don't pay their fair share in taxes, underlined the widespread feeling among the public that a select few play by a different set of more favorable rules than everyone else. The legislation before us today to repeal the estate tax reinforces that perception. It comes against a backdrop of increasing wealth and income inequality in the United States. The share of total wealth owned by the top 0.1% in the U.S. grew from 7% in 1978 to 22% in 2012, according to the National Bureau of Economic Research. In 2013, the median wealth of upper-income families, $639,400, was nearly 7 times the median wealth of middle-income families, $96,500, the widest wealth gap since the Federal Reserve began collecting data 30 years ago. The 80% of the American public in the Pew survey are not envious, they are incensed. This bill would help barely more than 5,000 households in the country in any given year at a cost of $269 billion to American taxpayers over the next decade, according to the Joint Committee on Taxation. That is $269 billion to benefit 15/100% of taxpayers, 15/100% of taxpayers, which this first graphic makes clear. You can see that 15/100% is such a tiny sliver that it's hard to see. All of those taxpayers, Mr. Chairman, will fill less than 1/10 of the seats of Lambeau Field. I double-checked that.
Now you're making it personal.
No, Detroit Lions have feelings about Lambeau Field, Mr. Chairman. Nearly 3/4 of the benefit of this bill accrues to people inheriting estates more than $20 million. More than 40% goes to those inheriting estates valued at $50 million and up. Those estates worth more than $50 million would each get an average tax cut of more than $22 million under this bill, as this second chart shows. The other legislation before us today, as you discussed, concerns the IRS and its treatment of nonprofit organizations. 5 of the 7 bills we have seen before. They were on the floor last year. We do not oppose them. I also support, and we do, the 2 bills that are new, including H.R. 1295, which would require 501c organizations to provide notice to the IRS within 60 days of forming. It also makes sense that when organizations provide that notice, they should also indicate whether they plan to engage in political activity or expect to file a report with the FEC. We intend to offer an amendment that adds that requirement. You mentioned briefly tax reform. I think today or tomorrow SGR is going to be brought up on the floor, which benefited from strong bipartisanship. I think it would be well if we could undertake a similar effort regarding tax reform more generally. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. And we'll keep your staff apprised about the schedule as it's going, so the members in the briefing can make it back for the estate tax. The first order of business is a bill introduced by Mr. Roscom, the Taxpayer Bill of Rights Act of 2015. Mr. Roscom, you are now recognized for an opening statement on your bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Very briefly, the Taxpayer Bill of Rights Act has benefited from input from Nina Olson, the National Taxpayer Advocate, as well as strong bipartisan consensus around a very simple idea that it should be the responsibility of the IRS Commissioner to ensure that IRS employees are familiar with the following. Now, you'd think that this is very straightforward, but apparently it needs to be articulated. That taxpayers have the right to be informed, the right to quality service, the right to pay no more than the correct amount of tax, the right to challenge the position of the Internal Revenue Service and to be heard, the right to appeal a decision of the Internal Revenue Service in an independent forum, the right to finality, to privacy, to confidentiality, to retain representation, and to a fair and just tax system. I am not aware of any opposition to this. I think it's very straightforward, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Per Mr. Levin's announcement, there are no opening statements on the IRS bills, so we will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 1058. Without objection, the measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, which was distributed in advance along with a green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for the purposes of an amendment. I will now turn to Tom Barthold, Chief of Staff to the Joint Committee on Taxation, to provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of substitute. I ask that members hold their questions until after his presentation. Mr. Barthold, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. You have before you two joint committee documents, JCX 53 and JCX 54, which describe the underlying legislation, H.R. 1058, and the Chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute. In short, the code prescribes a number of duties for the Commissioner of the Internal Revenue Service, and the legislation before you would add as a duty ensuring that IRS employees are familiar with and act in accordance with certain taxpayer rights that are enumerated in the legislation as described in the document. The bill would be effective upon the date of enactment, and it has no effect on, we estimate that it has no effect on federal receipts. Happy to answer any detailed questions the members might have regarding this legislation.
Any questions for Mr. Barthold? Seeing that there are no questions, are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Seeing that there are no amendments,
Chairman,
yes.
could I just have a couple of seconds to speak on the bill?
Sure. The gentleman wants to strike the last word?
Pardon, move to strike the last
Yep.
word.
Okay,
please.
gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, understanding the thrust of the proposal that's in front of us today, and we have generally been supportive of many of these pieces of legislation that have been offered, but I do want to call attention to the fact that during the last 5 years, $1 billion has been cut from the IRS. And that plays out in a constituency like mine in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, where the office has been closed. So that means that if you live in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, in beautiful Berkshire County, then your next stop, if you want to meet with IRS officials, is to travel to Albany, New York, or to Springfield, Massachusetts. And at a time when we would like to accommodate citizen requests as it relates to tax exposure, and to have questions answered for what is oftentimes a very difficult conversation, it becomes harder to do it. And I think to the point of the discussion today, as we talk about a Bill of Rights, what better way to enunciate our support for a Bill of Rights than to point out that you ought to be able to meet and talk to a local officer of the IRS who might ameliorate the concerns that you've raised. And these offices that we all hold frequently are visited by people who have IRS problems. And to argue, I think, perhaps that we're going to embrace a Bill of Rights and then eliminate the possibility for practicing that Bill of Rights is inconsistent with the notion of representative democracy when you consider that they can't oftentimes directly approach the office. You know, many of the concerns that come through our congressional offices frequently are Veterans Affairs, frequently Medicare issues, Social Security issues, and yes, IRS issues. And I think we can all say, to the point of making sure that we avoid personalities, or because these are very sensitive conversations, there are many people that appear in front of you in your constituent office who you never in a million years would have thought had an IRS issue. And I think we should make it easier for them to be in contact with an agency that has a difficult reputation in American life. But not to miss the point that we also can pride ourselves, when you consider some of our European friends, that the compliance ratio for tax collection in America is just around 90%, meaning that sometimes grudgingly people pay their taxes, but guess what? As opposed to some of the European democracies, they still pay their taxes. And they understand the outcome of it. But not to miss the point, Mr. Chairman, these cuts have been fairly substantial. And it makes it harder for our citizens to be in contact with an agency that sometimes looms quite large in their lives through these proposals. And I do wanted to make that point because I think it bears noting.
Right. Thank you. Does anybody else move to strike the last word? Mr. Roscom.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just in response to Mr. Neal's admonition, I think everybody recognizes, as he's articulating, that the IRS needs the resources that are compatible with the rights that we're articulating. But let's remind ourselves of two things. Number one, these aren't new rights. This is not some new big burden that the Internal Revenue Service is being asked to take up. As I mentioned, these are all very intuitive, and this is news to no one, particularly at the Internal Revenue Service. The other thing is, and I think this will come out, but this has come out of the work of the Oversight Subcommittee and others, there's a lot of places where the Internal Revenue Service can improve. Let me just give you one example, because it's a shocking opportunity for improvement. And we're going to debate this probably in Mr. Holding's bill later on, or we'll discuss it in the context of his bill. But since you brought it up, the IRS spent 10,000 hours reviewing about 4,000 applications for C4 groups and saying yes to everybody except 8 applications. Said another way, 10,000 hours on all of this work yielding very, very little as a result. By contrast, there were almost 3,000 501c3 charitable organizations that they just said, hey, we have no time for this. And the C3s sat there for over a year. So you're right that they need the resources. I agree with you that they need the resources, but this agency needs all kinds of help, all kinds of direction, and all kinds of leadership from Congress to follow up on the theme that the chairman was saying, look, this is an entity that works for the American people. We're the fiduciaries of that. It's all delegated authority, and they're just not doing it very well. Last point, and then you want me to yield.
Please.
Last point is, we can't fall into the trap of, this is like the school board that doesn't get its referendum passed. And so what do? They say, well, we're going to cut the football team and the orchestra instead of the vice principal in charge of looking out the window. You know what I'm saying? So there's an allocation question, and I think that we can do everything that we can do as a committee to make sure they get the resources that they need. But I think we're in a season now where we're going to have to be very directive, and I yield to the gentleman.
Well, if the vice principal is having a problem with the IRS, they're generally going to contact our congressional offices.
Well played.
And the point that I make is that if you're 75 years old and you have an IRS problem, for many people, they think it's looming capital punishment. And trying to alleviate the concerns and the anxiety that they feel, first of all, contacting our individual offices, and I know, looking at everybody here, you have the same sort of constituents that come through the office. They have the same problems across the country. And the reassurance that staffers give them, or perhaps a meeting with a member of Congress, is important, but then making sure that the IRS pays attention to their concerns so they don't live in this arrangement where they can't figure out what their exposure or responsibility is on their tax bill is really important. And I will just say this, I think you're right about some of the criticisms you offer. There's no argument there. But I would point this out, that I also think we've also had another similar experience. There has probably been not one case for any one of us where if somebody has a legitimate difference of opinion with the IRS doesn't try to work with them. That's an important part of what we do as well. So thank you.
I will
for yielding.
reclaim my time, and I will just know that silence is not assent on your last point. But I think we've expressed it well, and I'll yield back.
Will the
Does
gentleman
anyone-
further yield?
Does anyone else wish to strike the last word? Mr. Pasquale.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I got to say, you folks are very consistent.
Thank you.
That was not a compliment, but we'll get to this. Mr. Chairman, if you look at the total budget that we will be voting on soon today, not only my friend from Massachusetts has hit the nail on the head in terms of the IRS, in an attempt to punish the IRS employees, most of whom that I work with have been excellent, and my constituents tell me the same thing. But you've done the same thing in terms of oversight of Medicare. You've done the same thing in your budget in funding our fight against fraud and abuse. In fact, next year's budget is zero for oversight and finding fraud and abuse. I guess we've solved that problem. I guess we do not need that funding. The funding has been around $390 million. How could it go from there to zero? Only if I can conclude that we have removed all of the problems from Medicare, and we haven't. We have not completed all that. So you're very consistent. So this is a great anti-government move. Let the folks hate the government more. That's exactly what you want, and that's exactly what you're going to get. And we'll see the results of it. I give you the rest of my time, Mr.
All
Chairman.
right, gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Anybody else seeking to strike the last word on these bills or this particular bill? If not, I'll just strike the last word for a moment to simply say funding levels of discretionary agencies are determined by the Appropriations Committee, not by this committee. That's an important point to make. Whether the budget resolutions on the floor is immaterial to that point, that's something to be set later by the Appropriations Committee. And to Mr. Roskam's point, these are rights that the taxpayer advocate actually helped us uncover that were not being followed on. And so the goal here is let's put the taxpayer where he and she belongs in the center of the equation. They are the person that the IRS works for, not the other way around. And we're trying to make sure that we can reestablish that proper relationship with these bills. With that, I yield back the balance of my time. If there are no further amendments, the question is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended is agreed to. I will now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee favorably report H.R. 1058 as amended to the House of Representatives.
The question is on favorably reporting H.R. 1058. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. The H.R. 1058 is ordered favorably reported. Without objection, I ask that staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill, and that members may have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, or dissenting minority views. The second order of business is a bill introduced by Mr. Marchant, the IRS Email Transparency Act. Mr. Marchant, you are now recognized for an opening statement on your bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for your leadership on this bill, and thanks to Chairman Roskam and previous Chairman Bustani on bringing this bill to the forefront. We have a responsible, an important responsibility to the committee, to protect the American taxpayers. That's what our constituents sent us here to do, and we're here to act on their behalf. I believe we have the opportunity today, by moving forward this bill, that puts safeguards in place for taxpayers and brings greater transparency and accountability to the IRS. H.R. 1152 is a clear, straightforward bill that will prohibit IRS officers and employees from using personal email accounts for their official business. This bill came as a result of the committee's investigation into the IRS targeting of taxpayers based on their political beliefs. Some of these wrongly targeted by the IRS were constituents in my district. But the underlying issue of 1152 is about finding ways to fix the problem and ensure that such abuses never happen again. This is something that impacts all Americans. One of the abuses the committee discovered in our investigation was that some IRS employees use their personal, non-secure email to conduct official IRS business. In doing so, they also disclosed confidential taxpayer information. Lois Lerner, for example, routinely conducted official business involving taxpayer information on her personal email account. If that's not bad enough, nothing on her personal email is subject to official record keeping, which conveniently keeps the taxpayer information outside the orbit of proper scrutiny. Such reckless behavior by the IRS breaches the trust between the American people and their government. As I said at the outset, Mr. Chairman, this committee has a responsibility to protect taxpayers, and I believe that H.R. 1152 does just that.
Thank you. Per Mr. Levin's agreement, the minority will not have an opening statement. The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 1152. Without objection, the measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, which was distributed in advance along with a green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for the purposes of amendment. I will now turn to Tom Barthold, Chief of Staff to the Joint Committee on Taxation, to provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute, and I ask that members hold their questions until after his presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, you have before you two joint committee documents, JCX 55 and 56, which describe the underlying legislation and the chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute. In short, the Internal Revenue Service has existing administrative rules in place that ban the use of personal email accounts for official business. This legislation would codify that as a rule of statutory law with respect to the official business of the Internal Revenue Service. The provision would be effective upon the date of enactment, and we estimate that it would have no effect on federal receipts. Happy to answer any details that members might have.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Barthold? Seeing no members have any questions for Mr. Barthold, are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Seeing that there are no amendments, the question is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. I'll now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee favorably report H.R. 1152 as amended to the House of Representatives.
Question is on favorably reporting H.R. 1152. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. H.R. 1152 is ordered favorably reported. Without objection, I ask that staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill, and that members have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, dissenting, or minority views. Now to number 3. Our third order of business is a bill introduced by Mr. Kelly, the Taxpayer Knowledge of IRS Investigations Act. Mr. Kelly, you are recognized for an opening statement on your bill.
Thank you, Chairman. H.R. 1026 is a proposal that will allow taxpayers that have been victimized by the IRS, for example, through unauthorized disclosure of private tax information to find out basic facts. Things like, is my case being investigated? Has my case been referred to the Justice Department for prosecution? This bill passed on suspension in the 113th Congress. It was also Dr. Bustani and Mr. Roskin were on the earlier piece. It's unlawful for federal employees to disclose certain taxpayer information or inspect taxpayer returns or records without authorization. Current law also limits the lawful disclosure of taxpayer information by employees of the Treasury Department, including the IRS and the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration, TIGTA, to certain enumerated circumstances. Because of these restrictions, in cases in which a taxpayer makes a complaint regarding unlawful disclosure of this information, current law does not permit the Treasury Department to provide the affected taxpayer with information concerning the status or resolution of the complaint. All this does is give the same rights to the taxpayer that they should have to begin with. So if somebody's happening to their disclosing their tax information, they need to be told that there is an investigation on, has there been a leak, what the status of it, and where it goes from there. Right now, currently, they can't do that. The people who are being harmed are the same people that can't find out who did it to them or what's going to happen in the long run. So it's a very easy bill. This absolutely has no effect on revenue.
Per our Mr. Levin's opening statement, there will be no opening statement on the minority on this bill. The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 1026. Without objection, the measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, which was distributed in advance, along with the green sheets explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and consider base text for the purposes of the amendment. I'll now turn to Tom Barthold, JCT Chief of Staff, to provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. Ask members to hold their questions until after his presentation. Mr. Barthold, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. You have before you Joint Committee Documents JCX 57 and 58, which describe the underlying legislation and the chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute. In short, Code Section 6103 provides for the confidentiality of tax return and return information and limits disclosure to specified purposes enumerated under statute. Unauthorized disclosure or unauthorized reviewing is strictly prohibited. This legislation provides that in the case of a person who has provided information indicating a possible violation of unauthorized disclosure, unauthorized inspection, or certain other offenses by federal officers or employees, that the Secretary may tell that person whether an investigation, 1, has been initiated, 2, is open, or 3, is closed. This legislation would be effective on the date of enactment, and it would have no effect, by our estimate, on federal receipts. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any questions for Mr. Barthold? There being no further questions, are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of substitute? If there are no amendments, the question is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. I will now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee favorably report H.R. 1026 as amended to the House of Representatives.
Question is on favorably reporting H.R. 1026. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. H.R. 1026 is ordered favorably reported. Without objection, I ask that the staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill, and that members may have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, dissenting, or minority views. The fourth order of business is a bill introduced by Mr. Meehan, the Ensuring Tax-Exempt Organizations the Right to Appeal Act. Mr. Meehan, you are now recognized for an opening statement on your bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this legislation is really quite simple because what it does is it codifies the requirement for the Treasury Secretary to create procedures under which the 501c organizations that face an adverse determination can request an administrative appeal to the IRS's Internal Office of Appeals. This committee's investigation into the IRS targeting scandal uncovered that 501c organization applications were first being denied based on perceived political views, and later they were denied the right to an independent appeal as required by the 1998 IRS Restructuring Act. When this abuse was highlighted by the Ways and Means Committee, the IRS, to its credit, it issued interim guidance on May 19th, 2014, ensuring that all the groups subject to an adverse determination would be granted a right to appeal. And Mr. Chairman, if I may, I'd like to ask that the memo that codified that the IRS published it on May 19, 2014, be inserted into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this bill today, H.R. 1314, it codifies that guidance. And additionally, the bill passed on suspension in the 113th Congress. So I urge support for this common sense legislation to cement new taxpayer protections in the statute. And it certainly will help Americans have greater confidence that they will not be targeted by the IRS for their political views. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Per Mr. Levin's announcement, there will be no opening statement on the minority side. The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 1314. Without objection, the measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, which was distributed in advance along with the green sheets explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and consider base text for the purpose of the amendment. I will now turn to Tom Bartold, Chief of Staff at JCT, to provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute, and I ask members hold their questions until after his presentation. Mr. Bartold, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. You have before you joint committee documents JCX 59 and 60, which describe the underlying legislation and the chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute. The IRS, in the course of its reviews, may determine that an organization no longer qualifies for exempt status. If it arrives at such an adverse determination, the IRS must notify the organization of the right to an appeal. As noted by Mr. Meehan, under guidance promulgated on May 19th of 2014, administrative appeal to the IRS Office of Appeals of an adverse determination is permitted. Under prior practice, if an adverse determination was issued by the Internal Revenue Service's exempt organization's technical office in Washington, D.C., such an adverse determination could not be appealed to the Office of Appeals. The legislation before you codifies the guidance that was put into effect on May 19th of 2014. It would have an effective date of May 19th, 2014, and we estimate that this would have a negligible effect on federal receipts over the upcoming budget period.
Are there any questions for Mr. Bartold? There being no questions, are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Seeing that there are no amendments, the question is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. I will now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee favorably report H.R. 1314 as amended to the House of Representatives.
The question is on favorably reporting H.R. 1314. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. H.R. 1314 is ordered favorably reported. Without objection, I ask that the staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill, and that members may have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, dissenting, or minority views.
Mr. Chairman, would you yield for a moment?
Sure.
Just to point out, I know we're heading into the 5th of the less controversial bills before us. Is that correct?
Yes, this is the 5th. This is Mr. Holding bill. I believe the minority is preparing an amendment for this.
I just want to point out, just for the record, though, that each of these bills was never marked up in the last Congress, and I appreciate you marking up under regular order today. I want to make that point to you, and I hope that this is consistent not only with the Ways and Means Committee, but other committees. Unfortunately, in the first week we were here in Congress, H.R. 37, a controversial financial services bill was brought to the floor without going through regular order, and I hope that this regular order goes beyond the Ways and Means Committee and to other committees in the House as well.
You can speak for this committee, and this is the committee's intention to conduct business in regular order.
I just want to thank you for your commitment to regular order. That's what I'm thinking about.
Thank you, gentlemen. The 5th order of business is a bill introduced by Mr. Holding, the IRS Bureaucracy Reduction and Judicial Review Act. Mr. Holding, you are now recognized for an opening statement on your bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. H.R. 1295, the IRS Bureaucracy Reduction and Judicial Review Act, which is a rather long name for a bill that has just 2 simple goals. First, it will provide newly formed 501c4 organizations with a mandatory yet simple process for registering with the IRS. Process is, within 60 days of the establishment, new 501c4s would be required to provide a notice of formation and intent to the IRS. The IRS, in return, must issue an acknowledgement of receipt to the notifying organization, again within 60 days. Second, this legislation will offer 501c4s with the ability, offer them the ability to seek judicial review should the IRS deny their application for recognition, fail to act on an application, or inform an organization that it is considering revoking or adversely modifying its tax-exempt status. This would be conducted under the 7428 declaratory judgment procedure that's currently afforded other tax-exempt organizations. Mr. Chairman, it's important to note that this legislation does not change the requirement for a 501c4 to file an annual Form 990 or alter any of the reporting requirements associated with 501c4. Mr. Chairman, thanks to the work of the committee's oversight team, as Chairman Roscom has pointed out, we know that last year the IRS spent nearly 10,000 hours reviewing 501c4s. The legislation before us would simplify the review process for the IRS and allow them to better focus their resources on the thousands of outstanding 501c3 applications that are out there, which are mandatory to be filed. And with unanimous consent, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter that data that I've just referenced, which has been provided by the IRS, into the record.
Without objection.
I'd also like to thank Chairman Roscom for joining me as an original co-sponsor of this legislation, and I would certainly yield to him at this time for his remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Holding. The important point here on this legislation is it's an opportunity to clean up and streamline and make clear where C4s are, what the process is, and to do it in an expeditious, clear way. The review, and I mentioned this to Mr. Neal a couple of minutes ago as we were discussing this other work, but it's a remarkable thing to look deeply at how the IRS has been reviewing C4s, and I've now got them in front of me. Mr. Holding made reference to this a minute ago. They only disapproved 8 from over 4,000 applications. And so this is not time that's been well spent. So Mr. Holding's proposal goes a long way towards cleaning that up. I wholeheartedly support it, and I yield back.
And I yield
Gentleman
back,
yield
Mr.
back
Chairman.
balance at this time.
I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Per Mr. Levin's announcement, there will be no opening statement on the minority side. The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 1295. Without objection, the measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, which was distributed in advance along with a green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and consider base text for the purpose of the amendment. I will now turn to Tom Bartold, Chief of Staff at the Joint Committee on Taxation, to provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. And I ask members to hold their questions until after his presentation. Mr. Bartold, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. You have before you Joint Committee documents JCX 61 and JCX 62, which describe the underlying legislation and the chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute. This legislation creates certain new responsibilities on both 501c4 organizations and on the Internal Revenue Service. It would require that a new 501c4 organization file notice with the IRS within 60 days of its formation. Failure to do so would give rise to a penalty. The IRS, on its part, must acknowledge receipt of this information within 60 days. The 501c4 organization may still request, as under present law, a formal determination of status, and the IRS may seek additional supporting information from all new 501c4 organizations on the first Form 990 information return that they file. The legislation also provides that if the IRS denies status or fails to act, generally within 270 days, the 501c4 organization may seek a declaratory judgment. This is the same rule that applies to 501c3 organizations under present law. The legislation would be effective upon the date of enactment, and we have estimated that this legislation would have the effect of raising $1 million over the fiscal years 2015 through 2025. That concludes my description. Happy to answer any questions that the members might have.
Thank you. Are there any questions for Mr. Barthold? Mr. Davis is recognized.
Chairman, Mr. Barthold, how much does the Congressional Budget Office project that notice program users will pay in fees?
Thank you, Mr. Davis. As noted in the footnotes to the table on JCX 62, the Congressional Budget Office estimate reports that it would increase user fees by $15 million over the 2015 through 2025 fiscal year budget period.
Can I ask you, under the amendment by Mr. Holden, is the Appropriations Committee required to appropriate the user fees to the notice program?
The legislation before you puts no restrictions on, it says that the fees must be appropriated. It puts no restriction on how the fees are to be appropriated.
Well, under the amendment, is the Appropriations Committee required to appropriate the user fees to the Internal Revenue Service?
They're not required to direct them to the Internal Revenue Service or anywhere else. It's the appropriations process.
So is it correct that there is no restriction in the amendment that the user fees are appropriated to the program?
That's correct, sir.
And the user fees will continue to be collected even if the notice program is not funded?
If they're not appropriated back to the IRS, yes, that is correct. The fees will be collected.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Sure. Any other members have a question for Mr. Barthold? Seeing no further questions, are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, this is a technical amendment to eliminate any potential increase of direct spending in the bill.
If the gentleman suspend for a second, I understand copies of the amendment have been distributed in advance and shared with the minority. Now the gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, this is just a technical amendment to eliminate any potential increase of direct spending in the bill. And I would urge support and yield back.
Any further discussion on the gentleman's amendment? As no other member seeks recognition, the question is on agreeing to the amendment offered by Mr. Holding. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. Are there any additional amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute?
Yes.
Is it Mr. McDermott? You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Clerk will distribute the amendment, and I ask the gentleman just make sure it's distributed before you before you start. Yeah, just give it a second to be distributed.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Brady.
I reserve a point of order.
Gentleman reserves a point of order. Yeah, we're good? Okay. All right, I think we pretty much, this is the amendment we anticipated. I believe it is more or less handed out. In the interest of time, the gentleman from Washington is recognized for 5 minutes to describe his amendment.
I don't want the people to be without something in front of them, Mr. Chairman.
Just want to make sure it's the amendment we thought it was.
You don't think I'd bring something in? Mr. Chairman, I support this bill. It's a kind of interesting piece of good government from your side, and I'm glad to see it. But this amendment, you don't have to turn and smile. This amendment would help, I think, make the piece a little bit better. The amendment requires the notice and first annual return of a 501c4 to state the following: whether they have or plan to engage in political activities, whether they have or plan to file reports with the FEC about independent expenditures, and 3, whether they have or plan to file reports with the FEC about campaign disbursements. 501c4's designation allows the organization to keep their donor secret. You can go out today and start collecting money and tell people you have a 501c4, and you can collect it for a year and a half and spend that money without ever telling anybody. Well, you can put your application in for designation, but you don't have to wait for the designation to begin collecting money. So this is a good amendment. It's a good bill, basically. But what also needs to be there is some specificity about what you're going to do with it. The amount of money spent by these groups grew exponentially. In 2006, 501c4s spent $1 million in political activity. In 2012, they spent $250 million. So something's going on in this field, and the chairman is correct in bringing this bill up. But the IRS needs better information about their organizations and their activities, and for that reason, I offer this amendment.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time.
If nobody's going to respond.
Well, I think there will be, but let's yield
Do I
back
get
the
a
balance of your
chance to
time,
respond
and
to
then
that?
on their time, I'm sure they'll
Yeah,
be
use
willing to do that.
I give back
So,
the balance of my time.
gentleman yields the balance of his time. Are there any other members who wish a discussion on this amendment? Mr. Roscom is recognized.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we should resist the temptation to adopt the gentleman's amendment. It's already lawful for C4s to be engaged in political activity. So I don't think we need any more red flags and opportunities for the IRS to sort of target or use those sorts of possible initiatives vis-a-vis some C4 group. And remember, all of this information is going to be disclosed at the first filing of the 990. So all of the information comes forward at that time. So there's no mystery that's involved here. And if we're trying to streamline things, I think it's counterintuitive because the gentleman's amendment actually makes it more complicated. And at that, the gentleman's amendment doesn't speak to, nor does it mitigate or restrain any of the spending that's going on anyways. So what we are trying to do here, and I think with Mr. Holding's proposal, is to say, let's focus in on what the Internal Revenue Service needs in terms of tax administration. They need to know who, what, when, where, and they don't need to know what is going to be happening in the future. This has great overlay into the Federal Election Code and all these other things. So let's keep this and let's have the IRS focus in on tax administration alone. I urge a no vote on the doctor's amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Are there any further discussion?
And closing on my amendments here?
Yep, gentleman got the right to close.
Mr. Chairman, first of all, let me just clarify. The 1099 does not go to the FEC. It only goes to the IRS.
Will the gentleman yield? If I said 1099, I meant 990. I yield back.
It does, but it doesn't go to the FEC. They don't get this information. So the FEC will never know if there's a violation or they should file a claim or anything else.
Will the gentleman yield just for 1 second?
Yes.
So my point is, the information that the IRS needs goes to the IRS. And I recognize that they don't get that the 990 does not go to the Federal Election Code. What I'm saying is, if there's a violation of the Federal Election Code, there's another administration that deals with that. That's the only point that I was trying to make, and I yield back.
Okay, the point of this really is, you could start a 501c4 today for the election of 2016. You could collect millions of dollars, spend it, do anything you want, and you wouldn't have to file until 18 months from now. Now, if this bill passes, you'll have only, 90 days, which is better. It's much better than it presently is. But the fact still is, the people who are making a judgment about whether they should have a 501c4 should have some idea what they plan to do with it. I don't see, they're just supposed to say, well, they filed it, so we send them back their justification. The IRS has some responsibility to look at whether it is a 501c4 or it's a 501c3. That's really what we're just giving the responsibility to the IRS to do. And I think that that's why this information would be useful.
Gentleman yields back. Is there any further discussion? Seeing none, I note that a point of order has been reserved. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I withdraw the reservation with point of order.
Okay. As no other members seek recognition, the question is on agreeing to the amendment offered by Mr. McDermott. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. You want one? Okay. A roll call vote is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Johnson?
No.
Mr. Johnson, no. Mr. Brady? No. Mr. Brady, no. Mr. Nunez? Mr. Teaberry? Mr. Teaberry, no. Mr. Reichert? Mr. Reichert, no. Mr. Bustani? No. Mr. Bustani, no. Mr. Roscom? Mr. Roscom, no. Mr. Price? Mr. Buchanan? No. Mr. Buchanan, no. Mr. Smith in Nebraska? No. Mr. Smith, no. Ms. Jenkins? Ms. Jenkins, no. Mr. Paulson? No. Mr. Paulson, no. Mr. Marchant? Mr. Marchant, no. Ms. Black? Mr. Reed? No. Mr. Reed, no. Mr. Young? No. Mr. Young, no. Mr. Kelly? No. Mr. Kelly, no. Mr. Renacci? No. Mr. Renacci, no. Mr. Meehan? No. Mr. Meehan, no. Ms. Nome? No. Ms. Nome, no. Mr. Holding? Mr. Holding, no. Mr. Smith of Missouri? No. Mr. Smith, no. Mr. Levin? Mr. Rangel? Mr. McDermott?
Yes?
Mr. McDermott, yes. Mr. Lewis?
Yes.
Mr. Lewis, yes. Mr. Neal?
Yes.
Mr. Neal, yes. Mr. Becerra? Mr. Becerra, yes. Mr. Doggett? Yes. Mr. Doggett, yes. Mr. Thompson? Yes. Mr. Thompson, yes. Mr. Larson? Yes. Mr. Larson, yes. Mr. Blumenauer? Mr. Kind? Yes. Mr. Kind, yes. Mr. Pascrell? Yes. Mr. Pascrell, yes. Mr. Crowley? Mr. Davis? Yes. Mr. Davis, yes. Ms. Sanchez? Mr. Nunez? Mr. Price? Ms. Black? The gentlelady's not recorded. Ms. Sanchez, aye. Mr. Reed? Oh, sorry. Wait, I haven't. Ms. Black? Mr. Levin? Mr. Rangel? Mr. Blumenauer? Mr. Crowley? Chairman Ryan? No. Chairman Ryan, no.
The clerk will
11
report the
yeas,
vote.
20 nays.
11, repeat it, please.
11 yeas, 20 nays.
There being 11 ayes and 20 nays, the amendment is not agreed to. Are there any additional amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? If there are no further amendments, the question is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. 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 Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended is agreed to. I will now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee favorably report H.R. 1295 as amended to the House of Representatives.
The question is on favorably reporting H.R. 1295. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. H.R. 1295 is ordered favorably reported. Without objection, I ask that the staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill, and that members may have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, dissenting, or minority views. The next order of business is a bill introduced by Mr. Renacci to prevent targeting at the IRS. Mr. Renacci, you are now recognized for an opening statement on your bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for including Prevent Targeting at the IRS Act, H.R. 709, in today's markup. This bipartisan piece of legislation takes a common-sense approach to ensure American taxpayers are treated fairly by the IRS. When the American people learned the IRS targeted political groups for extra scrutiny, shockwaves were sent across the country. Not only do these actions represent an arrogant abuse of power, but they also violated the public's trust. Political targeting is not a Republican or Democratic issue, which is why this legislation passed by a voice vote in the 113th Congress. This bill is simple. It makes it clear that an agent's use of IRS authority in targeting individuals or groups based on their political affiliation is grounds for immediate termination. Political targeting contradicts the very principles this country was founded upon, and there is no reason for it in our democracy. It will not be tolerated. Though it has been nearly 2 years since we first learned of the initial abuses of the IRS, the American people's lack of trust in the federal agency remains, and rightly so. The Preventing Targeting at the IRS Act is common sense legislation that brings the accountability the American people expect and deserve, and I hope my colleagues today on both sides of the aisle will support it, and I yield back.
Don't you think we should?
The committee will now proceed, given Mr. Levin's earlier statement, there will not be an opening statement on the minority. The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 709. Without objection, the measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, which was distributed in advance along with a green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for purpose of amendment. I will now turn to Tom Barthold, the Chief of Staff to the JCT, to provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. I ask members hold on to their questions until after his presentation. Mr. Barthold, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. You have before you Joint Committee Documents JCX 63 and 64, which describe the underlying legislation and the Chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute. Present law requires that an Internal Revenue Service employee be terminated for using their position to extract personal gain or benefit by threatening audit. The legislation before you would broaden this concept to include an action to for threatening an audit in order to for political purposes. In addition, the proposal requires that the IRS terminate that employee. Under present law, the termination that is permitted may be mitigated in the judgment of the commissioner. The bill before you would remove that authority from the commissioner. The bill would be effective upon the date of enactment, and we estimate that it has no budgetary effect.
Thank you. Any questions from Mr. Barthold? Seeing none, are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of substitute? If there are no amendments, the question is on adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. I'll now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee favorably report H.R. 709 as amended to the House of Representatives.
The question is on favorably reporting H.R. 709. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. H.R. 709 is ordered favorably reported. Without objection, I ask that the staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill, and that members have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, dissenting, or minority views. Our next order of business is a bill introduced by Mr. Roscom, the Fair Treatment for All Gifts Act of 2015. Mr. Roscom, you are now recognized for an opening statement on your bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So imagine writing a check to an organization like the AARP or People for the American Way or the American Civil Liberties Union or a group on the conservative end of the spectrum, pick your group. And all of a sudden, a couple years later or whatever, you get a letter from the Internal Revenue Service, and the Internal Revenue Service says this: Dear so-and-so, your gift tax return has been assigned to me for examination. The IRS has received information that you donated cash to whatever, a 501c4 organization. Donations to 501c4 organizations are taxable gifts, and your contribution has been, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's been an impression that's been created in this letter that's an actual letter, and I ask unanimous consent to it inserted into the record.
Without objection?
It kind of creates an impression that there's actually a tax liability. Now, when this issue was raised with then Commissioner Miller after work in the last Congress by this committee, Commissioner Miller figuratively put up his hands and says, hey, we're backing off from that. We're not going to be pursuing those types of cases anymore. And that's a good thing that they've backed off, because that's clearly not the intent of Congress to make those kinds of gifts taxable events. So toward that end, what this bill does is it says contributions to C4s, C5s, and C6s are not taxable. It's fairly straightforward, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Per the opening statement of Mr. Levin, there will be no opening statement by the minority side. The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 1104. Without objection, the measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, which was distributed in advance, along with a green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for the purpose of amendment. I will now turn to Tom Barthold, Chief of Staff to the Joint Committee on Taxation, to provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of substitute. I ask members to hold off on their questions until after his presentation. Mr. Barthold, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. You have before you Joint Committee documents JCX 65 and 66, which describe the underlying legislation and the chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute. This legislation deals with an area of law that's been identified by a number of persons as lacking clarity. It provides for a deduction for gift tax, from gift tax for transfers to 501c4 organizations. 501c4 organizations are social welfare organizations. It provides a deduction from gift tax for transfers to 501c5 organizations. Those are labor and horticultural organizations, and provides the same deduction from gift tax for 501c6 organizations. Those are trade associations and business leagues. The legislation would be effective upon the date of enactment. Because of the lack of clarity under prior law, it also provides that there's no inference as to what happened, what the law was prior to the enactment of this legislation, and we've estimated that this would have no effect on federal revenues over the upcoming budget period.
Thank you. Are there any questions for Mr. Barthold? There being no questions, are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? If there are no amendments, the question is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Mr. Chairman, could I just ask unanimous consent to submit for the record a number of supportive letters from organizations across the country?
Without objection. The question is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. I'll now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee favorably report H.R. 1104 as amended to the House of Representatives.
The question is on favorably reporting H.R. 1104. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed signify by saying no. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. H.R. 1104 is ordered favorably reported. Without objection, I ask that the staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill, and that members may have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, dissenting, or minority views. Got everybody here? The last order of business, right? Ready? Okay, just want to make sure. The last order of business is a bill introduced by Mr. Brady, the Death Tax Repeal Act. Mr. Brady, you are now recognized for an opening statement on your bill.
Thank you, Chairman Ryan. I want to thank my Democrat co-sponsor or leader, Congressman Sanford Bishop of Georgia, for his leadership to repeal the death tax and his belief that you shouldn't punish success, as well as my colleague, Representative Christy Noem, and Congressman Mac Thornberry, a long-time champion. Can you imagine working a family ranch for 5 generations, more than a century, only to be forced to sell 2/3 of it to satisfy the death tax? Can you imagine decades of hard work building your family-owned business, only upon your death, Uncle Sam swoops in and demands nearly half the nest egg you've spent a lifetime building? These examples are real and are in this room today. The death tax is the wrong tax at the wrong time and hurts the wrong people. It's the number one reason why family-owned businesses aren't passed down to the next generation. It is Washington's most immoral and calculated attack on the American dream. Since the estate tax was temporarily imposed in 1916 to help pay for World War I, by every measure it's failed to achieve the purposes its supporters championed. It's robbed America's economy of $1.1 trillion in capital investment. It generates little annual revenue, less than enough to cover one day of Washington's spending. It hurts the economy, encourages income inequality, and fails to meet any basic standard of fairness. Ironically, studies prove that our economy and federal tax revenues would grow faster if the death tax were simply abolished. The George Soros, Bill Gates, and Warren Buffetts of the world, with their legions of lawyers and tax planners, won't pay the death tax. As we heard from our witnesses at Chairman Reichert's recent hearing, this tax burden falls on family-owned farms, on businesses and ranches. They are not Paris Hilton or the robber barons of Teddy Roosevelt days as portrayed by our Democrat friends. These are the hard-working, risk-taking, and determined Americans, often forced back to the bank for a loan or cruelly forced to sell off their land and business to satisfy the IRS. The death tax is especially destructive to women and minority-owned businesses in America who are building wealth often for the first time. Mr. Bob Johnson, the founder of BET Television, recently wrote to this committee, the death tax continues to pose a serious threat to the likelihood that present-day African-American owned businesses can be preserved as part of a family's long-term legacy. A study by Boston College professors estimate the death tax could rob African-American households of up to $250 billion of wealth over the first half of this century. Death tax supporters insist it's the key to our democracy, a necessary remedy to income inequality. But former Federal Reserve Vice Chairman Alan Blender found that only 2% of income inequality can be explained by inherited wealth. Turns out Americans build their prosperity from the ground up. Congress's own Joint Economic Committee reported that the death tax motivates wealth holders to reduce savings and increase spending now rather than pass it on to the next generation. This actually increases the consumption gap between the wealthy and poor. Today, death tax supporters may propose a special use valuation alternative to somehow exempt farms, ranches, and small businesses from the death tax. We tried this approach before in 1997. It just heaped additional burdens and complexity on family businesses and tied them up in red tapes for years after death. As award-winning Yale professors Grates and Shapiro concluded, everyone now agrees this was a complete and utter failure. Look, no more gimmicks. Our economy is suffering through a disappointing recovery, missing more than 5 million jobs. We need American entrepreneurs and family-owned businesses to close that serious jobs gap. But as our committee witnesses made clear, instead of hiring more workers, investing in their businesses, the death tax diverts their precious dollars and time to estate planning, millions of dollars and millions of hours. Imagine if all that could have been invested in new jobs and business opportunities. Mr. Chairman, let's give our children back their shot at the American dream and a better nation than the one we inherited. I urge my colleagues to work with me in ending the death tax once and for all. I yield back.
Mr. McDermott, you are recognized for an opening statement on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm kind of awed by that speech.
As well,
it sounds like the whole universe has been resting on the death tax. But the real irony of this is that while we're passing a budget over on the floor, where we're cutting the social safety net, we're making all kinds of cuts to student loans, we're making all kinds of cuts in health research, we're making all... in this committee, we're now going to blow a $270 billion hole in the bottom of the boat. Now, Republicans got to figure out which they want. Either you're going to pay for stuff, or you're not going to pay for stuff. Don't talk about pay-fors when we're talking about poor people's programs. And this one, there's no pay-for. This is just handing $270 billion out that door to a few rich families. That's what this is. Now, it is very hard for me to see you guys systematically dismantling the tax system. It seems this week's target is the estate tax. You're going to have trouble in the press tomorrow because you got that budget out there, which you're going to have to defend. Maybe the estate tax is to cover that, or why you did it on the same day, I have no idea. I mean, it seems like the worst political planning that I've ever seen. But I would mention that the death tax, as you call it, or the estate tax, was championed by someone Republicans hold up as one of the best their party ever produced, Theodore Roosevelt. This has gone too far. This proposed repeal is nothing more than a massive, unfunded tax break for a few of the wealthiest families in America. And, as usually the case with Republican tax policies, it does nothing for hardworking families in this country. This business of you drag in one farmer and one black person and one woman, and you say, look, this is destroying. This is about folks who are at the top of the schedule and have made money endlessly, and they want to pass it all on to their kids. For what reason? Just because they're their kids? So the issue here is really a genetic one. We should say to the American children, go out and find yourself parents that have money, and then be born to them, because that's basically what this says. It has nothing about the meritocracy which Mr. Roosevelt was really talking about. Is it worth it? Is it to hand out $1 trillion? The answer is no, it's not. Now, they haven't always hated taxes in the Republican Party. It used to be they thought they needed some to pay for the government. Roosevelt said, and I quote him, "The man of great wealth owes a particular obligation to the state because he derives special advantages from the mere existence of government." That's what Mr. Gates, that's what Mr. Buffett, that's what Mr. Soros, these are all these people who were just denigrated because they talk about the need for an estate tax to put that money back into the economy. That's what they're saying. They've done well. It doesn't bother them. They're going to wherever they're going, and they're going to leave a little on the table, which they think ought to go back into the economy. Now, we've always taxed estates. We did it in the Revolutionary War when the Federalists imposed it on an undeclared war with France. Abraham Lincoln did it during the Civil War. And we are now here in the midst of just after the first Gilded Age, back in the 1890s, why along came Teddy Roosevelt and said, hey, this ain't working. It's not working for America. We're going downhill. And that's what the progressive movement was all about then.
The gentleman's in the 1920s right now, but he's got 36 seconds left.
I understand it. I understand you want to interrupt me and take away my time, Mr. Chairman. I hope you give me a little bit more.
We'll have plenty of time for debate.
The fact is that one example that came to the committee, this guy came in and said that he had 15,000-acre farm. Do you realize that's 23 square miles? Now, this is somebody who says, I can't pay any taxes when I die. I can't do any of that. Come on, that's not a family farm. You cannot call 23,000 acres a family farm. This is a bad bill all the way around. And I won't go through the list, Mr. Chairman, of all the things you could pay for with this. 100% of school nutrition, or 3/4 of Pell Grants, or 100% of security benefits.
Time for the gentleman is expired. There will be time to strike the last word after the walkthrough. Time for the gentleman is expired. The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 1105. Without objection, the measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, which was distributed in advance along with a green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for the purpose of amendment. I will now turn to Tom Barthold, Chief of Staff to the Joint Committee on Taxation, to provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute, and I ask members to hold their questions until after his presentation. Mr. Barthold, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. You have before you Joint Committee documents JCX 67 and 68, which describe the underlying legislation and the Chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute. This legislation repeals the estate tax and the generation skipping tax upon the date of enactment. It retains the present law gift tax while reducing the tax rate under the gift tax to 35%. The gift tax, just to note, has a lifetime exemption amount of $5 million, which is an indexed amount, and the current value of that exemption for 2015 is $5,430,000. With respect to gifts and bequest and the basis in assets transferred by gift or by bequest, the legislation retains present law with respect to gifts, which means that gifts carry a carryover basis, and with respect to assets bequeathed, it provides for a stepped-up basis. We have estimated that the budgetary effects of this legislation over the fiscal period 2015 through 2025 would be a reduction in federal federal revenues of approximately $269 billion. Mr. Pascrell. And that concludes my description. Happy to answer any questions about details that the members may have.
Thank you. Are there any questions for Mr. Barthold?
Mr. Chairman.
No. Questions for Mr. Barthold or? Okay,
I'll
yes.
have a statement later, and I'll have
Great.
5 minutes later.
Yeah, I just want to make sure members remember, while we're considering amendments, members can move to strike the last word and make a statement if they wish to do so at that time. Right now, it's questions for Mr. Barthold.
Thank you,
Mr. Neal is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Barthold, what does joint tax do?
Well, we do a lot of different things, Mr. Neal. I mean, we try to help the members of Congress develop and craft the tax policies that they think are appropriate for the American people.
Do you assess a lot of data?
Yes, we do, sir. As the members are aware, we're charged under the Budget Act with providing members of Congress with estimates of proposed changes in the Internal Revenue laws.
And much of the good work that you do is really based upon credibility. Is that correct?
I hope I make credible presentations to the members. Yes, sir.
So if I were to ask you, based upon joint tax estimates in the year 2013, acknowledging that there were 2.6 million deaths in the United States and 4,700 estate tax returns reporting some tax liability having been filed, would you suggest for the committee how many estates really were exposed to the estate tax at that moment?
Mr. Neal, I believe for the Select Revenue Measures Subcommittee hearing, in the background material that we provided for the committee, we reported that data, and I know I'm wasting your question time, but I've found it was in table 2, and that was based on estimates of the number of people who passed away in the United States in 2013 and the number of estate tax returns filed which had a tax liability. Remember, the number of estate tax returns with a tax liability is a subset, generally reasonably significantly less than half of returns filed, and that's because under present law, if the entire estate is bequeathed to a surviving spouse, there's a 100% exemption for spousal bequests, and a number of individuals choose to make substantial bequests to charities. That's also an exemption, and so there are a number of estate tax returns filed for which there is no tax liability. Charitable exemption, spousal exemption being the two major reasons for that.
Mr. Barthold, would it be safe for me to say, based upon the great credibility and regard that we hold for joint tax here, that 99.85% of all estates owe no estate tax at all?
From the data in 2013, as we calculated, less than 0.2% of deaths gave rise to a return with a positive tax liability.
Thank you. And so it seems to me, Mr. Chairman, based upon the proposal here today, that you might be in a position to allow us to offer an amendment that would take care of those family farmers, and we'd be out of here in the next half hour.
That's not a question for Mr. Barthold. If the member wants to make a point.
Thank you, Mr.
we can
Chairman.
do. Okay. Are there any further questions for Mr. Barthold? Question for Mr. Barthold. All right, Mr. Pasquarello.
Mr. Bartholomew, would you agree? Because this is worth a week's debate. I know we're constricted, but we thank you for bringing it up. Would you agree that there's a large share of the biggest estates that we're talking about in this legislation? And that consists of unrealized capital gains.
Mr. Pasquarello, direct technical questions to Mr. Barthold, not subjective questions. That, in my judgment, is not a technical question.
I want to know if many of these dollars that have never been taxed, if he has the number for that in this small group that the gentleman from Massachusetts has referred to. How much money are we talking about, Mr. Bartholomew? I think that's very specific.
What is the question
that's
specifically?
That's not a subjective question.
Well, it was getting there. So what is the question specifically? What is the question specifically?
I want to know. If I would have been able to finish the question, I want to know how much of this money has never been taxed.
Mr. Pasquarello, I understand your question. I do not have with me today an estimate of the amount of the value of what would be accrued but untaxed gain on a number of assets, which I believe is your question was, since we noted the basis that there is step up in basis upon bequest under the estate tax and under the proposed legislation, it's possible for an individual to acquire an asset which appreciates in value, and that gain increase in value would not be included in income at any point to that individual. I believe that was what your question was. I don't have an estimate of the extent to which the estates above the roughly $5.5 million exemption level, the extent to which their assets are comprised of unrealized appreciation versus their basis in the assets.
Mr. Chairman, may I ask you the question then?
No. If the gentleman wants to strike the last word in debate, he can do so then. This is time for technical questions of Joint Committee on Taxation. You can make a point if you'd like. We'll see. Are there any further questions with Mr. Barthold? Mr. Davis is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Barthold, does the Joint Committee identify how many of the 5,500 estates that would be subject to estate tax in 2016 are minority or women-owned?
The Internal Revenue Service does not collect data on race. It would be possible for us to look at the number of estates which are estates of women.
Would you?
And that's because it probably wouldn't be perfect, but that's because we have the names. So.
Understanding, would you venture a guess?
It would not be good for me to venture a guess. In terms of, there is a good percentage of, let me call them higher wealth estates that are estates of women, and that's because often The woman is the surviving spouse of an estate which was otherwise large and had had all the assets in the state bequeathed with the spousal exemption to the surviving spouse.
Well, let me ask, does the estate tax under present law disproportionately affect small businesses or family farms that are minority owned?
Well, as I noted, Mr. Davis, I'm not able to answer that question because in tax statistics we don't collect minority, race, minority status.
I guess the reason I asked the question is the majority cites a study that suggests billions of dollars of minority wealth will be lost under the estate tax. However, the same study has an interesting table. We could see the chart, and it may be a little difficult to see, but looking at that chart, Table 5 says that 0.00% of African Americans have a household net worth in excess of $5 million. Under the findings of this study cited by the majority, I guess I'm trying to find out how many African American estates would be subject to the estate tax under the current law exclusion. I looked at the chart very closely, and all I could see was 0, 0, 0. And then I looked at it in an overall sense, where if we look at the total population, we're talking about 1.22% of the American households that would be subject to this tax. I just wonder if that translates into the billions of dollars in minority wealth that's going to be lost.
I'm sorry, Mr. Davis, I'm not able to really comment on the statistics that you.
I don't think that's that's not a joint tax document, so I don't think the JCT.
I'm not familiar enough with it. I mean, you raised some interesting questions, but I'm just not able to answer them.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman,
Thank you.
I was just trying to understand the data that we've received. And I yield back.
There being no further questions, I believe. Nope. Mr. Thompson, do you have a question for Mr. Barthold? Mr. Thompson's recognized.
The study that was passed out, I guess you have a copy? There was a lot of talking up here. I don't know that I understood you clearly.
Well, I have the table 5 now that
you have the table,
Mr. Davis
but you can't
was
confirm whether or not those data are accurate?
Well, it's not a joint tax product. That's why I think he can't.
I'm just asking.
Yeah.
It's a yes or no question. Yes or no answer.
Well, Mr. Thompson, it says that this work was undertaken at Boston College and draws on the Federal Reserve's Board of Governors survey of consumer finances, which is a periodic survey that they undertake where they report on types of wealth held, on wealth distribution. I'm familiar with the survey of consumer finances, but I cannot comment on how the scholars at Boston College went from the Fed data to what they've presented.
Fair to say reputable source, but you just aren't able to confirm.
I can't comment on Boston College. I take the Federal Reserve Board of Governors work as reputable.
I ask unanimous consent to submit this for the
Without
record.
objection.
Thank you.
Any further questions for Mr. Barthold? If there are no further questions, are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Seeing that there are no amendments, are there by chance any members who wish to strike the last word?
Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Nome, I know alternate. Ms. Nome, keep your hands up so I can see who it is. Ms. Nome is recognized.
Well, Mr. Chairman, when I was 21 years old, I was a college student, and I was taking classes, and had gotten home late one afternoon, and the phone rang, and I picked it up, And it was Joni. Joni was our farm secretary, and she said, Christy, your dad is stuck in a grain bin. And I immediately knew what she said was happening. Knew that he had gone into a grain bin and the corn had smothered him. And I said, turn on the fans and I'll be there in a few minutes. And I got in the pickup, drove as fast as I could to the farm, and got there. And by that time, they had taken payloaders and were ripping the grain bin apart trying to find him. They found him, started doing CPR on him. I followed the ambulance into the hospital, and they worked on him for hours into the evening. When the doctors finally told us that he had passed away, I remember opening the door to the little room they had kept our family in, and there was hundreds of people standing in the emergency room. So it wasn't only a tragedy to me and my family, it was a tragedy to the entire community that had heard what had happened. In fact, there was over 100 farmers in the yard within 10 minutes trying to help find him in that 50,000 bushel grain bin of corn. We were a family that grew up with a guy who could do anything. To me, he was Superman. He was my best friend. We spent every day together. He was 49 years old when he passed away, and his number one dream in life was to pass his family farm on to his family. And that's why he got up at 5 a.m. every day, was so his kids could farm with him and together if they wanted to. Now, as I was sitting there thinking, a month later when I got a bill from the IRS that said I owed death taxes because we had a tragedy happen to my family, all I could see was that we had land that my dad had started buying when he was in high school and that my granddad had bought. We had cattle, we had machinery, we had families depending on me to make good decisions. And all I could hear in my head was my dad saying, Christy, don't sell land because God's not making any more land. So I thought, my only options here are to sell the land, which we need to make a living, or to borrow it. Lucky for me, I had a community banker who took a chance on a bunch of kids and gave us a loan to pay our death taxes because our dad died. And for the next 10 years, I paid on that stupid loan for the federal government that threatened our family business because we had a tragedy. Now, I had to make decisions. I maybe couldn't buy new equipment that I needed because we had to pinch pennies. We sold some cattle down. We tightened our belts and we made it and gutted it out through those 10 years and made tough decisions. And we farmed as a family for 20 years and did what exactly Dad's dream was. People who sit in this committee today and say this only impacts the rich and wealthy have no idea what they're talking about. In my area, for what land is selling for today, this exemption only covers a farm up to 700, 800 acres. There's not many farmers in our area that farm that small land. They just can't make a living at it. So this will touch virtually every single person that I know that lives around me that is trying to make a living by growing the food that this world eats. And that's what farmers do. But the more that I have worked on this, and a big reason why I'm sitting in this chair today is because of how angry I got because of that death tax. It made me mad, and that's when I started serving on different boards and commissions, ran for the state legislature, and came to Congress, was because of how unfair this tax is. My family had already paid taxes on all the income that had purchased that land. We had worked it. We did not have cash in the bank. It was double taxation, and when my kids have to pay a death tax on it, maybe it'll be triple taxation. But I will tell you today that if you stand here today or sit here and make the argument that only rich and wealthy people pay this tax, that is not true. It's not true for almost every farmer and rancher in this country. It's not true for every small business owner out there. With the valuations that they have today, they may have equity, but they don't have dollars in the bank. And the only way that they can pay these taxes is by selling the very business that they hope and dream someday they can pass on to their kids. So it will be very difficult for me to listen to that argument today. And I hope that you do not make that argument today, because you will simply be wrong. And I know it because I lived with it. My family has lived with it. It changed us forever. And we miss my dad every single day and wish he was still here, not because of the taxes, but because he meant the world to us. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Neal is
Thank
recognized.
you, Mr. Ryan. I move to strike the last word, and I appreciate very much the position that Ms. Noam has made here, and I think we should be taking care of those family farmers, and the opportunity avails itself for us to do that today. Now, let me also respond. The principle here for the wealthiest in America And you know the distinction that we're drawing in this conversation. It is not about the family farm. That is not who we are pursuing in this case. But let me tell you, Ms. Noem, of my experience. My mother died when I was 13. We went to live and were raised by an aunt and a grandmother. My father died right after it. The principle here is not to create in America a permanent aristocracy. The principle here is not for us to serve in the House of Representatives and then suggest that somehow we're going to create eventually a House of Lords. How has that worked out in Great Britain? As Don Rumsfeld called it old Europe, and Mitt Romney said we don't want to fall into the trap of the mistakes that were made in Europe with those families of gentry. You want to create a viable opportunity in America for Steve Jobs and Bill Gates to prosper. You want to create an opportunity in America for people who start with absolutely nothing to have a great idea, to have a great innovation, or to be creative. That's the aspiration of immigrant grandparents that I had when they arrived in America without any education. So I'm suggesting here, as I did last week, that we can take care of the family farm issue that Ms. Noem has mentioned, and she's right about it, and at the same time address the issue of who is really, under the disguise of this proposal, being helped. And that's the idea of what happens to wealth in America in the fourth and fifth generation from billionaires. And I think we would all agree that there is a system of equity and aspiration that we ought to acknowledge and honor. After all, that's what sets us apart from old Europe.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Noem, thank you so much for sharing your story. I think all of us, and Mr. Neal, you're right. My dad was a parts picker in a Chevrolet parts factory. He was one of 9 kids. He and my mother started a business after he went off to war and came back home, started with a little Chevrolet store in Verona, Pennsylvania, with a one-car showroom, 5 service stalls. They worked 7 days a week through that. I used to get on the railroad siding with me, even unloaded the cars off the railroad trains with my grandfather, who was on a B&O conductor, was so proud of his son that he got a Chevrolet store after he came back from the war and worked to get it, scraped some money together from a lot of friends that helped him, and he was able to maintain and build this business. My dad's greatest fear was that he would die before he could pass the business on to us. Now, this is not an unusual story. I mean, it's the story of America, and we're not just talking about farms. We're talking about small businesses. We're talking about people that work 7 days a week, put everything in their life into something so they can give it to their kids and hopefully their grandkids. We're into the 3rd generation. We have had more near-death experiences in our business than you can possibly imagine, but it made us stronger because we survived it. And we sit here and we talk about the real wealthy. I am so sick and tired of this administration every single day dividing us as a people. This is not about money. This is about putting your heart and soul into something and building it from nothing into something that you are so proud of that you want to pass it on to your kids, and hopefully your kids can pass it on to their kids. This is not about the extreme wealth. I'm so tired. Why do we in this country completely go after, oh, they're wealthy, oh, they must be terrible, oh, they're not paying their fair share, oh my God, are you kidding me? We are taxed and taxed and taxed. We're taxed at the local level, we're taxed at the state level, we're taxed at the federal level. We can't even die without being taxed. We have an addiction to spending, and the only way we can handle it, the only pusher on the street is a taxpayer that will supply us with the cash we need to keep injecting. To even have this, that we even have to have a discussion about people who've worked all their life and want to turn their business over to their family and somehow hold them hostage for it, is absolutely unbelievable.
Would the gentleman yield?
No, I'm not going to yield, because I'll tell you what, I think we've yielded for far too long on subjects that don't make sense to anybody except those who have never built something from nothing. And then we sit there and we want to tell them how they're supposed to do things, how they're supposed to die, and how much they're supposed to leave to the government, because they're not entitled to give it to their kids and hope that their grandkids have the same opportunity. This is America. A government shouldn't be able to take from you your life's work A government shouldn't be able to take from you the dreams that you have for the next generation. A government shouldn't be able to take from you the very fabric of who this country is and why these people come here. Hell, we're the only country in the world that's worrying about putting up fences to keep people out, not to keep men. Why do they come here? For opportunity. This is unbelievable. And we're going to have a discussion because we don't think these people pay their fair share. It is not about the wealthy. It is about those that have worked all their life and want to pass something on to the next generation. My God, there's nothing more American than that, and there's nothing less American than taking something from a private individual by a government. That's not the way it works. The government serves the people do not serve the government. How did we get so damn upside down in the way we think? And I'll tell you why it is. We're addicted to spending, and we don't know how to fund it, so we go to the people that supply every cent of revenue, and we keep draining them and draining them and draining them, and then we hold them hostage. They can't even die in peace. I yield back.
To keep it nice and smooth, Mr. Pasquarello. Just for a little calmness in the room.
Mr. Chairman, I promise you I'll keep my decibels down. If you hear and you talk long enough, myself included, you always wind up putting your foot in your mouth. And at the end, my friend Mr. Kelly from Pennsylvania, I don't say that in minimizing it at all. But what you said at the end of your conversation really spilled the beans. When you said, those who make the wealth, well, you know what? I read Samuelson to all of the modern economists. They do not agree with you. We're not talking about the little people here. No, we're not. In fact, let's stay on the legislation, as the chairman said. He's warned me a few times over the years in different committees. Let's stay on the legislation of 1105, presented by my good friend from Texas, Mr. Brady, South Texas. Let's stay on that legislation. Here we are today. We're making up legislation that's going to add $294.8 billion to the deficit. The whole idea that the estate tax hurts middle-class Americans and income that has already been taxed is simply not true. Repealing the estate tax in full, which is what this does, would result in a massive tax cut for the wealthiest of the wealthy. Let's be even more precise. Let's deal specifics. Let's not deal with heart-wrenching stories. I have one. Everybody in this room, I'm sure, has one. This tax hits 5,500 households in the United States of America, with estates worth more than $5 million. That's what this bill is about. It's not about the little guy. Not at all. This bill only further exacerbates our already upside-down tax code. We have an upside-down tax code. The ones at the top have all kinds of lawyers, and we don't. And we don't. So we complained about the tax code of the 18 years I've been here. 95% of it has been written by people that have more than 10 million or 12 million or $50 million. The little guy, who writes the tax code for him? I sit on the House Budget Committee. And after sitting through 13 hours of budget markup last week, I could tell you that this $294.8 billion would go a long way in making up for the devastating cuts that you're going to be held responsible for if this budget passes. It's also important to note that this budget does not assume the repeal of the estate tax. Here we go. Watch underneath the walnuts here. Instead, it assumes a revenue-neutral tax reform. Revenue neutral. Assumes that the revenues will be, we should be discussing this all day, the 13 hours. This is a mirror to all of our situations here, which may bring us together. It may bring us together, believe it or not. Not this phony hello and goodbye stuff that we want real cooperation here, real unity. This is one America, not two Americas. We really have only two conclusions to draw from your own budget. Either this bill is directly contrary to the budget, you spent all week on the floor defending, or it's not paid for. This committee will at some point down the road mark up a tax hike to pay for this massive deficit finance tax cut for the wealthiest Americans. You quite simply can't have it both ways, my friends. You can't. You're exposed. And for you to sit up there and talk about the poor minority are going to be helped, if that isn't the peak of animus, I don't know what is. I don't know what is.
Gentleman,
I'm disgusted, Mr. Chairman, with this bill particularly. I'm not disgusted with the budget. We have differences of opinion.
Gotcha. Time for the gentleman has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome. Mr. Smith from Missouri is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To strike the last word. You know, I represent the 18th poorest congressional district in the state of Missouri. I mean, in the country. So out of 435 congressional districts, that's pretty big. And when you look at the Boot Hill of Missouri, it's the Mississippi Delta, and our economy in the Boot Hill of Missouri is farming. The largest community in my 30 counties is 38,000 people. And in that Boot Hill, the price of farmland is roughly $10,000 an acre. And if you look at our country as a whole, 97% of all farms are family-operated and family-owned farms. 97%. And when you look at the average farm in the United States is 441 acres, you times that by $10,000, that's that's $4.4 million. When you look at the Boot Hill of Missouri, our average family farms aren't 441 acres. Like Representative Noem said, our average family farms are 700 to 1,500 acres to survive, to have their livelihood. So they're above this exemption. And let me tell you, those folks aren't rich. They're not. They've worked hard every day of their life for generations to earn to what they have. And this tax policy punishes people that have worked for generations after generations to save. And if you look at farmers, they don't have big bank accounts. They have to invest in farm machinery, cotton pickers that are $600,000. They have to invest in combines, $450,000. I mean, you talk about expenses just to earn just a little bit. And for people on this committee to say that these are the wealthy of the wealthiest, come to the Boot Hill of Missouri. I'd be happy to show you all how we are barely making it and barely getting by. These kind of policies do nothing but punish the people that I represent and the people that I come from. And for people on this committee to say that this is only helping the wealthy, come to Southeast Missouri. That's all I have to say, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I appreciate the gentleman yielding back his time. We think we have floor votes in about 20 minutes, and it's going to be a long series, so we're hoping to wrap this up before then. So if members don't feel that it's necessary to take all 5 minutes, that would be helpful to the end goal here. Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
It is about money. In this particular bill, it's about $270 billion over the next 10 years, and I think we all ought to be mindful of that. But it is also about ag land, and I think that's incredibly important, and I think we should be having more than a short-run debate on this issue. Ag land's important, farmland's important. As a matter of fact, according to the American Farmland Trust, since we've started this hearing, we've already lost about 150 acres of farmland in our country. We're losing about an acre a minute of farmland, and that's a real tragedy. It's a tragedy because we need it to sustain agricultural businesses. We need it to sustain our food supply, our wildlife habitat, and clean water and a healthy environment. And the truth is, family farms are impacted by all of the things, including estate tax. And I think we have a prime opportunity to deal with that. A lot has been said about the value of farmland and whether it's just the rich or is it the just farmers struggling to make ends meet on the farm. And I have some numbers that I want to share. There's 2 million family farms in the country, and the average price per acre is $7,200. And as Ms. Noem mentioned, in some parts of the country, you can't make a living on a few acres. You've got to have a lot of acres in order to make a living. And the more acres you have, the more value you have, and it doesn't take long to get over that $5 million threshold. In other parts of the country, land prices command a lot more than $7,200 an acre, and I know because I represent one of those areas. In my district, if you take the least valuable farm land, it's about $14,000 per acre. Prime ag land in some parts of my district will cost you $300,000 an acre. And in order to make, even with a high-value crop, in order to make a living, you need to have more than just one of those acres. So it can get up around the $5 to $10 million very, very quickly. The other problem we have, and we talked about this a little bit in our subcommittee hearing, but we're losing farmers as well as farmland. And according to the Department of the Labor Department, the median age for farmers and ranchers is 55.9 years of age. And things like the high cost of land and the cost of getting into farming impacts that and drives that number up. Young people aren't going into farming. It's too doggone hard. And I think Mr. Neal's correct. We could deal with the agricultural component of this, protect our food security, protect our environment, our habitat, our clean water in a matter of seconds. And I talked about my legislation to provide a provision where if the family farm is passed on and if the heirs continue to farm, they would be exempt from paying the tax until such time that they do something else with it. You know, you sell it for condominiums and move to the beach. Well, you know, the people who gain that value, gain that wealth, should pay their inheritance tax just like anybody else who works to make their wealth. This is an easy thing that we can do, and I hope that when we get done with this political exercise, that we can come together and focus on the policy and the policy issues that are impacting our agricultural community, our agricultural neighborhoods, and all the things that everyone today has expressed concern about. So hopefully, Mr. Chairman, we'll be able to deal with a state tax and take the politics and the rhetoric out and deal with a very real problem. But this bill doesn't do it. This is a $270 billion bill that doesn't address the problems that we have before us. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Smith from Nebraska is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the interest of time, I will be brief. I know that the topic of unrealized capital gains taxes was mentioned earlier with an inquiry. I think it's important to note that we are, yes, talking about federal tax policy, but we must remember local tax policy as well. And I come from a state that has a significant property tax that is an unrealized capital gains tax, let's face it. And farmers and ranchers pay a significant amount of local property tax. And we should always keep that in mind. It's interesting to hear the various perspectives of well, what is a family farm and what isn't. But I know that there has been some reality brought to that situation here today. I hope that we can arrive at the fact that we want to avoid double taxation. We want to arrive at better tax policy, and certainly the status quo is not what I would consider appropriate tax policy. I yield back.
Thank you. Gentlelady from California, Ms. Sanchez, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, too, will try to be brief, but I can't help but feeling like I've been lectured a bit today. I want to make a broad statement, talk about some examples, and then bring it back to that broad statement. Somebody once told me that wealth or money is kind of like manure. If you pile it up all in one big place, all it does is just stink. But if you spread it around, things grow. And that's what we're talking about here today. We've heard very compelling stories about family businesses and family farms, and I'm not trying to detract from that. I think they're very compelling stories, and like Mr. Thompson, I'd be willing to work to try to help address those. But when people say we're not talking about the super wealthy, I want them to look at this chart and tell me that this 0.15%, even though it may include family farms and family businesses, tell me that that 0.15% doesn't include the Paris Hiltons of the world and the Ivanka Trumps of the world, who will inherit millions of dollars, tax-free if this bill passes. And let me tell you what the cost is. You've heard the number thrown around by my colleagues, $270 billion. $270 billion that we will not collect on these estates, not from the person who died, so there is no death tax. We don't tax a dead person. They don't pay any more taxes after they die. We tax the heirs who inherit it, yes. But the whole point of doing that was so that there wouldn't be this accumulation of wealth, this huge pile of manure that gets passed from generation to generation, creating an aristocracy, much like Mr. Neal said. We do it so that we can spread it around and that the social cost will be the greater good. So let me talk about what that $270 billion, which if we pass this bill, we will not collect from the Paris Hiltons and the Ivanka Trumps of the world. Granted, I'd love to work on the issue of the family farms and the family businesses, but those people would pay no tax on what they inherit. Even when you win the lottery and you win millions of dollars in the lottery, you're taxed on your lottery earnings. But these people would now not have to pay any tax on their inherited wealth. That $270 billion, you know what that could pay for? 100% of school nutrition programs. That's school lunch, school breakfast, summer food, which provides nutritious meals to 31 million children every day. And in the United States of America, where 1 in every 5 children is food insecure, I think that's a worthwhile thing to invest in. These tax cuts for the wealthiest of the wealthy could pay for almost 3/4 of the cost of providing Pell Grants to more than 9 million students a year. That's an opportunity for somebody to get an education and to get ahead and to have an opportunity to do better than their parents did. More than half of the 2015 budget deficit could be financed by what we're going to leave on the table if we pass this legislation. All transportation and infrastructure appropriations for the next 3 years could be paid for with the money that we're going to leave on the table because we don't want to tax, heaven forbid, we should tax the wealthiest of the wealthy. You could fund NIH's budget for 2015 9 times over to the tune of $29.9 billion with the money that we want to leave off on the table because we don't want to tax the family farm. I don't want to tax the family farm, but I do want the Paris Hiltons who have very little to do with the wealth that they're about to inherit. Conrad Hilton, now he was the man that created that wealth. He was the industrious, hard worker, visionary guy that created that wealth. Why should his granddaughter, Paris Hilton, get to inherit all those millions of dollars for doing nothing because she was born into the correct family? I'm sorry, but I feel like I've been lectured a little bit. I want to talk a little bit about my experience. I come from a family of 7 kids. I come from a father who was an industrial mechanic, worked with his hands, and did backbreaking labor 14 hours a day, 6 to 7 days a week to support our family. And you know what I expect to inherit from him? Nothing. Because you know what my father gave me? He gave me the opportunity at an education. He gave me an opportunity to use my brain and to contribute something to society by my own effort, labor, and sweat. I don't expect to inherit anything from him. I don't feel entitled to inherit anything from him, much less an estate that's over $5 million. I don't expect that I'm entitled to inherit that, even though he was a small business owner.
Time
and
for
with
the
that,
gentlelady.
I will yield back the balance of my time.
Time the gentlelady has expired. Mr. Ruckert is recognized. Like I said, when everybody put their hands up, I wrote them all down. If new hands come up, they're not going to send to the vote. So, okay, Mr. Ruckert is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also come from a family of 7, the oldest of 7. My mother and father both passed away and unfortunately didn't inherit anything except the fact that I grew up as a Christian and have a strong heart and a caring for everyone and all the people that you just mentioned, Ms. Sanchez. Mr. Chairman, thank you. I'd like to offer my support to Mr. Brady's legislation in repealing the estate tax. Last week, Mr. Neal and I held a hearing on the burdens family businesses and farms face planning for and paying for the estate tax. But first, just let me address the issue of the offset argument that the other side has made. We saw last week at the Select Revenue Measures Subcommittee hearing how the death tax burdens family businesses and farms. If people want to talk about offsets at a later stage of the process, as death tax repeal gets closer to becoming law, we can have that conversation at that time. But we don't want to delay this important legislation. We don't want to slow down this process of moving this piece of legislation forward, as we see very important. We don't want to get it bottled up in committee and never see the light of day because we get bogged down in debating offsets. So we think repealing the death tax so businesses and farms can focus on growing, hiring, and raising wages rather than how to plan for the death tax is an important policy to help grow the economy and create jobs. And last week, we heard from more compelling stories like we did today, but we heard from witnesses about the impact of the tax, both in terms of the actual tax liability the estate tax imposes, as well as the challenges for planning. Now, we did have a rancher and a farmer in the hearing, and I won't repeat some of their testimony, but I think it's important to point out that this doesn't just affect, as Mr. Neal and I heard last week, ranchers and farmers, but one of our witnesses, Mrs. Madonia, family-owned distributor of refrigeration, HVAC, and other supplies, told our committee last week that if something were to happen to my dad and we were left with a large estate tax bill, we'd have to literally sell parts of the company in order to pay the tax. She's also, in her testimony, mentioned holding back large amounts of cash in reserve and not being able to put it into her business, grow the business, and hire people. So it affects small businesses. And Mr. Chairman, I'd like to take a moment in my 2.5 minutes left to read a quote from a letter that Mr. Neal and I received from Mr. Robert Johnson, founder of Black Entertainment Television, founder and chairman of the RLJ companies. And he says, and I quote, "As a minority business owner, and I believe I speak for the majority of minority businessmen and businesswomen, I feel that the estate tax is specifically unfair to the first generation of higher net worth African Americans who, despite being subject to historic social and economic discrimination that has severely limited their access to capital and business opportunity, have accumulated wealth through hard work and entrepreneurship. This level of taxation continues to pose a serious threat to the likelihood that present-day African-American-owned businesses can be preserved as a part of a family's long-term legacy. Full repeal of the estate tax would allow African Americans to pass the full fruits of their businesses and their success to the next generation, and thereby laying the foundation for a permanent minority ownership class that can contribute to the economic growth and development of the United States economy," end quote. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to enter this letter into the record.
Without objection.
And I yield back my time.
Mr. Levin is recognized to strike the last word.
I would like for all of us to pick up the point that
Linda Sanchez made. I think it's a mistake for anyone here to paint their story as the American story. My guess is for virtually all of us, indeed all of us, we have a separate story that is part of the American story. And I think it's good we're having this debate, but I think it's a serious mistake for someone to essentially say his or her story is the American story, discounting the story of millions and millions of others. I also think it's a serious mistake to talk about class warfare, because we're talking about less than 1%, 15/100th of 1% of the people who are affected by this. If there's been any warfare in the last 30 years, if you want to put it that way, it's been warfare affecting the incomes of the vast majority of middle-class Americans. They're the ones who haven't done very well. Working families. The data are indisputable that the very wealthy in this country in these last decades have done very, very well. We have the worst distribution of income or wealth of any industrial nation on earth. And to talk about it is the opposite of warfare. Let me also say, we should, if there's a problem, the problem isn't the 99% of the people who have to pay estate tax or their heirs. Here's the data about family farms and small businesses. According to USDA, roughly 0.6% of all farm operators' estates owed any estate tax in 2014. That's from USDA. And here's data from the Tax Policy Center. Only 20 small businesses and farm estates nationwide owed any estate tax in 2013. So essentially what you're proposing is to essentially extract from our budget, you don't pay for it, $269 billion when 99% of that money does not affect small farms or small businesses. If there is a problem for that tiny percentage, let's zero in, but not let everybody use them to leapfrog on this question. For the vast majority of those who pay estate tax, should there be one? This is the vast majority. It's been a legitimate question in this country for 100 years. Don't dismiss it. And don't talk about an American experience without being respectful to the experience of every family around this table and every family represented by virtually, if not all, colleagues in this House and in this Senate. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Renacci is recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll try and keep my remarks brief, too. I originally wasn't going to say very much until I heard one of my colleagues say that this affects the wealthiest families in America and does nothing for hardworking American taxpayers. I want to talk about constituent stories, people back in my district. I want to talk about, as a CPA and someone who has done estate planning, the issues that many hard-working American taxpayers have had to face. This is not about the Hiltons This is not about the Trumps. This is not about the Buffetts. This is not about the Soros. And this is not about the Gates. I heard all those names. They have some of the best attorneys and best tax planners that can eliminate their tax liability. If you really start to look at what we're talking about that group of hard-working American taxpayers, and not just family farms. There are also small businesses that have a lot of capital-intensive equipment, that their value of their business exceeds that $5 million. And that's a problem when it comes to a death. Now again, we could say it's not a death tax, but quite frankly, it's an estate after death, and there's a tax on that estate. So really the tax is generated from a death. And what happens here, and I see this in Wayne County, Ohio, I go to that farm at 4 o'clock in the morning. That's where I have to meet with those hard-working Americans and talk to them about their issues. And it's not just one individual. It's usually brothers and sisters and uncles, and they're all working together, worried about what's going to happen when the estate tax, the death tax occurs to them. It's about the business in Cleveland, Ohio, that is very capital intensive, making very little money, but very capital intensive, and all of a sudden there's a death in the family, and they have to figure out what they're going to do. They can barely make ends meet. Now they got to go borrow money. Now they got to go do things that they didn't want to do just to try and keep the business going forward. I appreciate the comments many of my colleagues have made about we've got to fix this. This is a fix. This is a way of fixing a situation. And when you talk about many of these individuals that don't pay tax, remember, statistics can be used any way you want them to be used to make your point. But remember, we have transfers to spouses, we have transfers to charitable trusts. Many wealthy or individuals that aren't paying estate tax aren't paying it because they're using the system. But I'm more concerned about that American taxpayer who gets caught in the middle, whether it's a small business or a family farm, and then they have a situation where they have to go out and borrow money, sell off land, and do many of the things that they shouldn't have to do to pass things on to the next generation. So I'm a big believer that we have to look at specifics, and I'm very supportive of this bill for that reason. We have a broken tax system. This is one of the pieces that's broken. We need to fix the entire tax system too. I yield back.
Mr. Davis is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I too shall be brief. We've had a very compelling discussion, and I agree with Mr. Neal, Mr. Thompson, Ms. Sanchez, and others who have suggested that we could find a way for the family farm fix. But I represent a district where the median income is less than $50,000 for a family of 4. As a matter of fact, it's $44,000. And I've heard quotes from 2 dear friends of mine, Bob Johnson and Harry Alford, and I'd certainly like to see some minorities get into this bottom line on this chart where they've got $5 million that they've got to worry about. Bob used to be a staffer here, and then he left and went on and did what he's done. Outstanding person. But I think the bottom line becomes, as I was getting ready to come over, I got a call from one of my constituents. I also represent something called the Gold Coast, the Magnificent Mile. Individuals who have been able to do quite well. And this constituent of mine called, identified herself as a 1%er. She said that she strongly opposes repeal of the estate tax and the budget because they both take money from the poor rather than from people like her who can better afford it. She said that her grandmother had to pay a large estate tax when her husband died. She said it was just the cost of being in a good position. She then went on to say that I've provided for my children and my grandchildren. Keep the estate tax. Have people like me who can afford to pay it do so. And I think she echoes the sentiments of many people in this country, and I yield back.
Now for closing out, the author of the amendment of the bill, Mr. Brady.
Chairman, thank you. I'll be very brief. Is this the government's money that you've worked a lifetime to build up, or is it yours? And is it your children's? Is it your family's? We're told today the big argument is this chart. You know, these are all the taxpayers. These are the only ones, that tiny little line, you can barely see it. There's just too few of them. They don't really matter. We don't need to care about them. But I'll tell you who's in that very small line. It's Kristi Noem's family. And it's all the families around her farm who were hit by this terrible death tax. We're warned not to think of them as the American story. They are the American story. It's Tammy Fisher. She was here earlier. You know, she was a staffer here. She went home to Texas to settle her aunt's estate. Her brother, in 100 years in their family, 5 generations, they managed to save their ranch by selling 2/3 of it to give it to the IRS. Story after story after story, we hear about the impact of the death tax. And at the end of the day, Kristi Noem and her family aren't aristocrats. Tammy Fisher and her brother and their family, who managed to save their farm by selling 2/3 of it, she's not Paris Hilton. It's real clear here. If you think those who've worked a lifetime to build that nest egg, if they're somehow aristocrats and Paris Hilton and the robber barons of the Teddy Roosevelt era, if you think this effort to help them is disgusting, as has been said, vote no. Just stand where you want to stand. But if you believe we ought to encourage Americans to work hard and risk hard and do everything they can to build wealth, because in that tiny sliver, there are African American businesses and women-owned businesses, Hispanic-owned businesses, and the fastest-growing Asian American businesses building wealth for the first time to give their kids a better life than the one they started with. So if you believe they should stand a chance and we ought to preserve the American dream for them, then I urge you to repeal this death tax once and for all. I yield back.
There being no further discussion and there being no further amendments, the question is on adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. I now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purpose of offering a motion. You got it? There you go.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee favorably report H.R. 1105 as amended to the House of Representatives.
The question is on favorably reporting H.R. 1105. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed by saying no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. A roll call vote is requested. I ask members, keep it down while the roll call vote's going. Last time it got a little noisy. It was even harder for the clerk to hear. So if people have to get going, vote and keep it down. Yes, I'm looking at Mr. Crowley. A roll call vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Johnson?
Aye.
Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Brady?
Aye.
Mr. Brady, aye. Mr. Nunez? Aye. Mr. Nunez, aye. Mr. Teaberry? Mr. Teaberry, aye. Mr. Reichert? Mr. Reichert, aye. Mr. Bustani? Mr. Bustani, aye. Mr. Roscom? Mr. Roscom, aye. Mr. Price? Mr. Buchanan? Mr. Buchanan, aye. Mr. Smith of Nebraska? Mr. Smith, aye. Ms. Jenkins? Ms. Jenkins, aye. Mr. Paulson? Mr. Paulson, aye. Mr. Marchant? Mr. Marchant, aye. Ms. Black? Ms. Black, aye. Mr. Reed? Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Young? Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Kelly? Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Renacci? Mr. Renacci, aye. Mr. Meehan? Mr. Meehan, aye. Ms. Noem? Ms. Noem, aye. Mr. Holding? Mr. Holding, aye. Mr. Smith, Missouri? Mr. Smith, aye. Mr. Levin? No. Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Rangel? Mr. McDermott? No. Mr. McDermott, no. Mr. Lewis? No. Mr. Lewis, no. Mr. Neal? No. Mr. Neal, no. Mr. Becerra? Mr. Doggett? Mr. Thompson? No. Mr. Thompson, no. Mr. Larson? Mr. Larson, no. Mr. Blumenauer? Mr. Kind? Mr. Pascrell? No. Mr. Pascrell, no. Mr. Crowley? No. Mr. Crowley, no. Mr. Davis? Mr. Davis, no. Ms. Sanchez? Ms. Sanchez, no. Mr. Price? Mr. Rangel? Mr. Becerra? Mr. Doggett? Mr. Blumenauer? Mr. Kind? Chairman Ryan? Yes. Chairman Ryan, yes.
The clerk will report the vote.
22 ayes, 10 noes.
There being 22 ayes and 10 nays, the motion is agreed to. H.R. 1105 is ordered favorably reported. Without objection, I ask that staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill, and that members may have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, dissenting, or minority views. There being no further business before the committee stands adjourned.